Trevor and I spent a lot of time together working on this project, and it's fantastic to see it come into full bloom in this book. I assume that you will all be walking out with a copy, but in case you haven't fully digested it coming in, I'd like to draw Trevor out a little bit on how this came about, because this is a man who spent more than a year of his life on Freedom of Information Act documents from the FBI, and so you might wonder what would possess you to do that. How did this come about? How did you start going down this rabbit hole?
So it actually started for me in 2006. I was a reporter in Miami, and there was a case that was announced involving 7 men from Liberty City, which is a poor section of Miami. And at first, it seemed just initially to me a bizarre plot. Alberto Gonzalez came out to announce the case and said that these 7 men were here to declare ground war on the United States of America, and we're going to bomb the Sears Tower and the Miami Beach office, or the FBI office in North Miami Beach. Well, obviously, the question was, like, how do 7 guys declare ground war on the United States of America? It was just ridiculous. And then I realized that there was an informant involved. Early on, it was clear that these men didn't have a connection to Al-Qaeda, that the connection was an undercover FBI informant who was posing as an Al-Qaeda operative, and that was their only connection to terrorism at all. And so I did my stories when I was in Miami, and I kind of put that in my back pocket. And over time, I realized that there were more and more cases being announced, and they all had this similar pattern. That was that the people charged with terrorism were involved in these fantastical plots to bomb subway stations, to bomb downtown office buildings, but they never had the means on their own. They never had the ability to acquire weapons. And those weapons were provided by either an undercover agent or an FBI informant posing as an Al-Qaeda operative or an affiliate of a terrorist organization of some sort. And so right around 2010, I began to question, well, how can we figure out how many of these cases have existed since 9/11? How many of the hundreds of terrorism prosecutions since 9/11 were involving real terrorists who are serious, imminent danger, and those involving people that had no capacity for terrorism on their own, but for an informant or an undercover agent providing them with the means? And so I had applied for, every year, Lowell Bergman at the Investigative Reporting Program hosts 3 journalists to pursue a project that could take a year or more. And I pitched to him doing something that took a holistic look at all of the terrorism cases that had come to U.S. courts since 9/11 and figure out how many of them involved a terrorist and how many of them involved people I would later term dupes that had no capacity for terrorism on their own but for that FBI informant. And so, working with Monika, we ultimately produced a story that looked at that entirely. And what we found is that of more than 500 terrorism prosecutions, 1 of every 2 involved an informant. Sometimes the informant did what you'd expect. He provided information. But in the cases of more than 150 defendants, the informants either played a part in the plot or, as in the case of 50 or more than 50, played the role of an agent provocateur, where he provided the means and the opportunity for people who, on their own, never had that capacity. And I think what's important about that, and what's the underlying part of the findings, is that we can show these dozens of men who never had capacity on their own for terrorism, but the ones who did have capacity are actually very few. Najib al-Azazi, who came close to bombing the New York subway system, Faisal Shahzad, who came close to bombing Times Square. These were dangerous terrorists, but as I mentioned in the book, you can really count on one hand the number of people who actually posed a serious threat. And then the others are people like the Liberty City 7, this case in Portland going to trial right now involving a man named Mohammed. They never had capacity on their own. They never had the ability to acquire weapons, but the FBI provided them with all of the means they needed to go from being these men on the fringes to essentially dangerous terrorists overnight.
So take us inside one of these cases, if you would, because the stories you tell in the book are really quite astonishing.
One of my favorite cases, many of the cases are very complicated, so it's hard to tell them quickly, but one of my favorite cases to tell is in a situation like this is about a man in Illinois named Derek Sharif. And according to the documents, we don't know exactly why the FBI targeted him, but the FBI decided that he was a potential terrorist threat, and they assigned an informant to go talk to him. And at the time, Derek had recently converted to Islam, had been ostracized by his family for it, and was working in a video game store and had no place to live. Just the day before the informant came in, actually his car had broken down. And the informant goes into the video game store and strikes up conversation with him. It's just before Ramadan, and during that conversation, Derek tells a sad story to this informant, and the informant says, well, you could come live with me, and I've got a car you can use, you can eat my food. And Derek, being a religious, says, well, this must be the work of God, and sure, I'd love to go do that. And over the course of several months, they talk about Islam, and the informant encourages him to, get involved, to take action for, the terrible things that the U.S. government is doing to Muslims around the world. And Derek then says, kind of in his brash way, well, I want to smoke a judge, I want to kill a judge. And Derek didn't know the names of any judges, but he still said that. And the informant then says, well, what about if we attack the shopping mall? And Derek excitedly says, yeah, I want to go attack a shopping mall. And he's getting very excited about it. And at that point, the FBI has essentially a sting in place. But the major problem the FBI had in this sting was that Derek didn't have any money. And the FBI needed an overt action. They had to have more than just talking. So they needed him to acquire weapons. And the informant says to him, well, I know an arms dealer who can sell you grenades. And I know you don't have any money, but you've got these old stereo speakers. And I think if you took these stereo speakers to the arms dealer, he'd take them and just say, trade, here's the grenades. And I don't know much about black market arms, but I'm pretty sure no arms dealer is going to take stereo speakers for grenades. So Derek then dutifully goes to the shopping mall. And in the parking lot of the shopping mall is the arms dealer, and of course it's an undercover FBI agent. And Derek brings over his old stereo speakers and hands them over, and the agent then hands over the 5 grenades that are actually inert, and other agents rush in and arrest him and charge him with conspiracy to conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, and he's serving 25 years in prison. And what's revelatory to me about that is that obviously this is a man who isn't a danger to himself, or if anything is a danger to himself, isn't a danger to other people as a terrorist. But during the sting operation, he actually said to the informant at one point, if it wasn't for you, I probably would have just ended up stabbing someone with a steak knife. And that illustrates his capacity. He was capable of a minor crime at best, yet through this elaborate sting operation, we were able to, the government was able to go to the public and say, here it is, another terrorist caught, another plot foiled.
So something you did, because you're a journalist, not an historian, as it were, is that you were able to talk to actual people and find out what they were thinking in this process. And you especially really made an effort to get a sense of why the FBI would be doing this and what the rationale is from the Bureau's point of view.
Right. There are a few people who've worked in the FBI who are critical of this, but in general, of this program, but generally what you find among FBI agents, current and former, is a general support of this program. And in the FBI's view, what they believe is that Al-Qaeda, as it existed on 9/11, isn't as it exists today. That there isn't the capacity for a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda to send from overseas a cell of people who will commit a horrific crime. And instead, they're concerned about what they term lone wolves, which are people already here in the West who are disaffected, disillusioned, have bad feelings about the United States, want to go do something, and that they will then watch an Al-Qaeda video, a jihadi video, and that will inspire them to act, and then they will launch an attack of some sort. And what the FBI refers to this as is Al-Qaeda-ism instead of Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda moved to this franchise model, unable to create terrorists of its own. It would kind of infect them with this idea, and then they would go carry out this attack. And so what the FBI is specifically looking for are people who are on this spectrum that the FBI terms, on one side is operational, and then on the other side is a sympathizer. So what they want to do is find someone who's on that line on the sympathizer side that's just about to cross over to operational, to become a terrorist, and catch him before he becomes a terrorist. And these sting operations are intended to draw them out, to find the people interested in committing some sort of act of violence, and arrest them through the only means the FBI has, which is the criminal justice system, prosecuting them according to some sort of law, which in this case would be conspiracy to use weapon of mass destruction or other terrorism-related cases. But through these sting operations, identify them first. And I think it's easy to be empathetic to the FBI's view, and I try to talk about this in the book, which is that if you're a case agent and you have this guy on tape and he's saying, I want to bomb that building, or I want to bomb the subway system, you probably don't want to be the guy who says, yeah, let's just ignore him and he'll mature out of it, and then 6 months later he actually does commit an act of terrorism. And so I think that's easy to understand that why the FBI would pursue these kind of types of cases. But what I put out in the book is that there has yet to be an example of someone who on their own is incapable of terrorism, someone who's a loudmouth, someone who doesn't have any weapons, who on a chance meeting meets an actual Al-Qaeda operative and says, hey, here's a bomb. The only people providing the capacity is actually the FBI. And these sting operations are kind of an evolution of drug stings, where you've seen where in the movies that's been glamorized, where a guy's got an empty briefcase and 2 people believe there's cocaine inside and they hand over money, and then they hand over the empty briefcase, the person opens it, it's empty, and they rush in and they arrest the person. Well, a sting like that